In the poem تضيق بنا الأرض, the earth is closing on us, the renowned Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish apocalyptically asked, following the humiliating defeat and ousting of the PLO from Beirut in 1982, where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? For those who've recently traveled in Israel, Palestine, I think that all of us here have, and witnessed the various ways whereby Jews and Arabs live together, either as military occupiers and occupied subjects, or as fellow citizens, divided into a ruling Jewish majority and an underprivileged Arab minority. Darwish's words seem relevant today perhaps more than ever, as approximately 13 million Jews and Arabs share the same geography, but continue to participate in widely different realities. One group is prospering and enjoy freedom of movement, while the other exists in the continuously shrinking spaces of a vanishing nation that is not only radically limiting movement through discriminatory policies, military checkpoints, and invasive security procedures, but is squeezing Palestinians out of their land and off the world map altogether. When one thinks about how this unjust situation persists, or what the outcome might be, the turn to the future does not seem at all unreasonable, despite Palestinians' urgent, even pathological need to look to the past to clutch on to the memories and narrations of a lost homeland. Parallel worlds, frictionless occupation maintained by smart borders, and multiple and virtual realities are only some of the ideas that come to mind in describing the present situation and what might lay ahead in the future. The purpose of my talk today is to employ the term Palestine 2048 as a signifier referring to the future as a site of criticism. The first part focuses on the emerging genre of Palestinian science fiction, the second on something I want to call speculative criticism. To begin, in recent years, a number of Palestinian artists and writers have been turning away from the past in their work and directed their gaze toward the future. Looking at Larissa Sansour's short film trilogy, Ibrahim Nasrallah's and Ibtisam Azim's novels, The Second War of the Dog or The Book of Disappearance, and Basma Ghalaini's short story collection Palestine Plus 100, it's clear that in turning to the future, these works are not really trying to predict possible futures of the Israeli-Palestinian impasse. Rather, inspired by Western sci-fi, noir, and aesthetics, dystopian fiction, and high-tech satire, they explore through futuristic settings current crises related to issues such as, among others, territory, identity, climate change, technology, and the Israeli other, some offering dark satiric fantasies along the lines of Emil Habibi's Pesoptimist, and others shockingly realistic ones capturing the horrors of Israel's ongoing military occupation of the Palestinian territories. Chronicling the present through futurity, these works take part in what Frederick Jameson describes as science fiction's structurally unique method for apprehending the present as history, or what Robert Dugan terms as the genre's capacity in making us aware of the historicity of the present. To exemplify, I'll briefly talk about Mazen Marouf's The Curse of the Mudball Kid from Ghalaini's short story collection to show how a Palestinian text set in the aftermath of the apocalypse envisions continuation when the nation has shrunk to the extent that it can no longer house a single Palestinian, somewhat echoing Darwish's inquisitive lines about the unknown after the last sky. The Curse of the Mudball Kid is set in Greater Israel, vis-a-vis the Palestinian apocalypse. All Palestinians have been removed from Tel Aviv, Haifa, Akka, the Galilee, and transferred to the south of Israel, where in 2037, they're exterminated with the use of biological weapons. One Palestinian, however, survives, the Mudball Kid. But in reaction to the biological weapons, he undergoes severe physical changes and transforms into a bio-threatening substance, which the Israelis have to place in a special double-layer glass cube filled with insulating gel to contain his energy. He's assigned a guard, Ze'ev, who closely monitors his energy level, and once a month, Ze'ev takes him out for a display at primary schools in various Israeli towns and kibbutzes. Symbolically, the deformed Mudball Kid is unable to speak and respond to the Jewish kid's inquiries about his Palestinian origins. He's the last Palestinian on earth, and similarly to his ancestors, he's metaphorically transformed into a faceless substance whose ability for communication has been completely hampered. To cut a long story short, a series of events lead to the disintegration of the Mudball Kid, but the pieces of his deformed body fall off and turn into the ghosts of the Palestinians who were killed in the 2037 massacre. Eventually, Israelis are doomed to have these ghosts living among them for the rest of their lives. With time, the ghosts invading Israelis' private property become a common sight. And I'd like to read this excerpt from the story to give you an idea of the tone of how this situation is described. As for the spectral bodies, the inhabitants of Greater Israel Sea, they act with complete confidence. They go for walks in the woods or in the markets or in the old towns. They go into shops or onto the beaches. They float over the houses or sit near an old school, looking at a tree or lying in the sun. Some of them can be seen putting their ears to the grass, as if they're listening, as if they know the place well. But although the scene is normal, there's nothing disturbing about it. It strikes terror in the hearts of kibbutz residents. The curse of the Mudball Kid ends on a rather Borgesian note. The realization of Greater Israel will not erase Palestinian from the surface of the earth, and in this bizarre situation, Ze'ev poses an unsettling question. Can anyone prove that they are the ghosts and not us? This Borgesian twist highlights the crux of the situation, someone mirroring the strange reality of today's Israel-Palestine, where, as I mentioned in the beginning, approximately 13 million Jews and Arabs live together but participate in widely different realities. It seems that beyond the last frontiers, after the last sky, in the aftermath of the apocalypse, Palestinian writers imagine that perseverance is fundamentally dependent on Israeli anxiety. In Greater Israel, Palestinians might no longer be physically present, and yet the Israelis will never be able to get rid of them. I want to stop here and move on to the second part of my talk, to what I started out referring to as speculative criticism. And this is where I become extremely shameless, because I'm going to be promoting my forthcoming book by talking about this, to make you all excited and to buy it when it comes out. In the concluding chapter of my forthcoming book, which explores the proliferation of Palestinian experiences across borders, languages, and generations since the 1870s till today, I experiment with the term Palestine 2048. My hypothesis is based on the idea that a century after the founding of the State of Israel, Israelis will have come to the conclusion that this nation-state gig is not really a Jewish thing, and decide to return to their respective diasporas, the diaspora being the natural habitat of the Jew and not the democratic framework. And the Palestinian, By now, culturally diverse communities from around the world reunite in the homeland to establish a free and independent Palestinian nation state. The larger part of my experiment focuses on questions about how these different groups will be able to overcome the diverse consequences of displacement and build a nation together. Palestinians who have endured decades living under different forms of military occupation will be different from those who enjoyed Israeli or Jordanian citizenship, who would then again be different from the millions of Palestinians who arrive from the refugee camps. Returnees from developed Western countries would not only be different among themselves, depending on context, but also from the rest of the Palestinian population, both economically and culturally. My point is that Palestinians would not merely be Palestinian, but memories of displacement would become an integral part of the Palestine 2048 identity. It would therefore be necessary to ask, how might the institutions of this nation accommodate these varieties and nuances? Which elites would emerge and attempt to hegemonize the nation in their image? Would parliamentarian representation be based upon these distinctions, or would the new nation state marginalize these backgrounds? If all of this sounds a bit far-fetched insofar as this experience seems to be challenging the concept of a unified Palestinian people, we only need to look at the Israeli experience as an experiment in identity making. Instead of viewing Israel as the outcome of Jews' successful return to carry on a historic legacy that was cut short 2,000 years ago, as the Zionist story goes, is it not today reasonable to assume that past diaspora experiences shape the various configurations of Israeliness? An Israeli is not merely Israeli, but diasporic origins delineate Mizrahi, Ethiopian, Sephardic, or Russian. These categories explicitly divide the Jewish Israeli society and more or less determine social class and political representation in the Knesset, showing that the making of Israeli culture is an ongoing process of collisions, negotiations, interrelations among the various diasporic narratives. In this historically exceptional context, experiences of displacement have not only not evaporated, but also determined the making of Israel's social and political structure. Going back to Palestine 2048, I imagined, for example, bringing together politicians such as Ayman Odi from Israel, Hanan Ashrawi from the Palestinian Authority, Rashida Tlaib from the United States, and Nasser Khadr from Denmark, to explore questions and on what it means to be Palestinian and a politician in these different contexts, where they represent very different constituents in fundamentally different contexts, and to explore how they view themselves and the consequences of their work in relation to the idea of a Palestinian nation 3 decades from today. Moving from politics to culture, imagine bringing together Palestinian and Palestinian descendant writers or filmmakers from around the world to discuss their works. Lina Marwen from Santiago, Chile, Susan Emaddi Darash from Maryland, US, Selma Dabber from London, Ahmed Mahmoud or Mahdi Flefel from Copenhagen, Ala Ehlehel or Majd Kayal from the Galilee, and so on. What do they imagine writing about in Palestine 2048? How will literature and other forms of cultural production look like in the utopia of one Palestine complete? Which themes will artists, filmmakers, and literary writers address now, insofar as notions of exile, diaspora, nostalgia, occupation, and discrimination will subsist as part of history rather than pervade the immediate present? Where will artistic creation head toward? Would the artist now be free from the tentacles of the Nakba? Will the next generation's Emil Habibi write about the tragic comic troubles of urbanization and alienation in Palestine rather than about the Israeli invasion? Which symbol will now replace the olive tree? Which settings would frame the story in the future Hani Abu Assad's next film? Who will the next Palestinian protagonist be? Before concluding my talk, I want to turn the kaleidoscope one last time. What's the point of all of this? What's the point of imagining a free and liberated Palestinian nation? My aim is not, of course, to predict possible future, but to employ the concept of future to reassess the present while looking ahead. As I continue to develop the reality of Palestine 2048, it is becoming clearer that in the current ongoing absence of a Palestinian nation state, several epistemic Palestines, similarly grounded in memories and narrations of the past, are coming into being as Palestinians everywhere are grappling with different realities, thus envisioning different futures. I think I'm going to stop here, so thank you.